The Nebraska sun beat down on the Vance farm with the unforgiving intensity of a blast furnace. Heat shimmered in visible waves above the cracked, parched earth of the driveway, distorting the dilapidated silhouette of the main barn. It was a farm that had seen its best days decades ago, a sprawling expanse of weathered wood, sagging rooflines, and rusting machinery that stood as silent monuments to a fading era. The air was thick with the scent of dry dust, baked pine, and the faint, lingering metallic tang of old diesel fuel. It was the smell of hard work, and more recently, the smell of slow, inevitable defeat. Eli Vance sat on the shaded porch of the farmhouse, a solitary figure dwarfed by the quiet decay surrounding him. He was a man carved from the very land he worked, his skin cured to the texture of worn leather by 70 years of sun and wind. Deep creases mapped the corners of his eyes and mouth, holding the residue of countless seasons of worry and labor. His hands, resting heavily on the knees of his faded denim overalls, were scarred and calloused, the knuckles swollen with arthritis. He stared out at the horizon, but he wasn't looking at the fields. He was looking at the end of his life's work. The bank had finally run out of patience. The letters had turned from polite reminders to bold-faced demands, and finally to the cold, legal certainty of foreclosure. The asset liquidation was the final indignity, the carving up of his legacy before the vultures even landed. The heavy, oppressive silence of the afternoon was suddenly shattered by the crunch of tires on the long dirt road leading to the property. Eli didn't move, but his eyes tracked the rising plume of pale dust. Emerging from the haze was a vehicle that had no business on a county road, a sleek, silver luxury sedan, its clear coat gleaming obscenely against the backdrop of rust and ruin. It navigated the ruts and potholes with painful slowness, finally coming to a halt near the farmhouse steps. The driver's side door opened and Samuel Harrison stepped out into the stifling heat. He was a stark contrast to everything around him. Young, perhaps in his late 20s, he wore a crisp, tailored blue dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up exactly twice, and dark, sharply creased trousers. His leather loafers were immaculate, at least until they touched the powdery Nebraska dirt. Samuel represented Asset Liquidation Solutions, a firm based out of Omaha that specialized in turning failed dreams into neat rows of numbers on a spreadsheet. He adjusted his sunglasses, grimaced at the dust instantly settling on his shoes, and grabbed a thick, heavy-duty clipboard from the passenger seat. He moved with a brisk, nervous energy, a man whose time was measured in billable fractions of an hour. "Mr. Vance," Samuel called out, his voice sharp and carrying an edge of practiced corporate authority. He didn't wait for an invitation to approach the porch. "Samuel Harrison, we spoke on the phone. I'm here to assess the physical assets against the outstanding ledger." Eli finally stood, his joints popping in a slow, staccato rhythm. He descended the porch steps, towering over the younger man despite his stooped posture. "I know why you're here," Eli rumbled, his voice rough as gravel. "Excellent. Let's not waste any time then," Samuel said, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "The heat is brutal, and I have 3 more properties to evaluate in the county before sunset. I'll need to see everything. Tractors, implements, outbuildings, scrap piles, everything with a serial number or a salvage weight." The walkthrough was a grueling exercise in humiliation for Eli. They moved from piece to piece, the blistering sun beating down on their necks. Samuel was ruthlessly efficient. He didn't see the history. He didn't see the hours of sweat, the midnight repairs under floodlights, or the harvests that had paid for his childhood. Samuel saw only depreciation curves, oxidation levels, and salvage yards. "This John Deere 4020, Samuel said, kicking a flat, rotted tire. "Engine block looks cracked. Hydraulics are shot. It's essentially 1,000 pounds of low-grade cast iron at this point." "My father rebuilt that engine himself in '85, Eli interjected, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "It ran just fine up until a few years ago. Just needs a new gasket and some fluid." Samuel sighed, a short, patronizing exhalation, and scribbled rapidly on his clipboard. "Mr. Vance, I appreciate the sentimental value, but the market doesn't pay for nostalgia. It pays for utility. And currently, this machine has 0 utility. I'm marking it at base scrap value." They moved on. A rusted baler was dismissed as unrecoverable. A row of worn disc harrows was categorized as mixed metal salvage. Every assessment was a physical blow to Eli, a dismissal of his entire existence. Samuel spoke in a language of liquidity, obsolescence, and salvage margins, words that sounded foreign and cruel in the dusty farmyard. Finally, they rounded the corner of the largest, most dilapidated barn and came face to face with the centerpiece of the farm's decaying fleet, the old International Harvester 1460 Combine. It sat in the shadow of the barn, a massive, slumbering behemoth of faded red paint and oxidized steel. It was an intimidating piece of machinery, even in its current state of disrepair. The once bright red panels were chalky and peeling, revealing patches of brown rust that spread like a slow disease across its flanks. The massive front driving tires were deeply checked and cracked with dry rot. The grain header attached to the front looked exhausted, its tines bent and missing. Samuel stopped and stared at it, pushing his sunglasses up into his hair. He let out a low whistle that conveyed zero admiration. Well, this is a dinosaur. Eli felt a familiar surge of protective pride mixed with deep sorrow. She's an IH 1460, bought her used, but she was the pride of the county back in her day. Axial flow rotary, changed the way we harvested. She's pulled thousands of bushels out of these fields. Samuel wasn't listening. He was already doing his walk-around, his pen flying across the paper. He poked at the rusted side paneling. He peered under the chassis. He checked the belts, which were frayed and brittle as old rope. "The feeder house is completely worn through," Samuel stated, his voice a flat monotone of condemnation. "The auger is bent. I can see daylight through the bottom of the grain pan, and judging by the oil slick beneath the engine block, the main seal blew a decade ago. Has this thing even been turned over in this century?" "She's been resting," Eli muttered stubbornly. "Things got tight. Couldn't afford the diesel to run her, let alone the parts to fix her. But the bones are good." Samuel stopped his pacing and turned to face Eli. He adopted a posture of exaggerated patience, the kind a weary teacher uses with a slow student. He held his clipboard tightly against his chest. "Eli, let me be brutally honest with you. My company evaluates assets to maximize return against debt. We look for buyers. No farmer is going to buy a 30-year-old seized-up combine with a rusted-out chassis. No dealership will take it on trade. The cost to haul this monstrosity away on a lowboy trailer will likely exceed the value of the scrap metal it contains." Samuel tapped his pen against the paper for emphasis. "It's beyond repair. It's beyond salvaging for parts. It is quite literally just dead weight taking up space on foreclosed land. The absolute best I can do, and I'm stretching my authority here, is offer you $50. And that's only because I know a scrapper in Lincoln who might be willing to drag it away for the iron weight if he's already in the area. $50. The number hung in the suffocating air, an insult so profound it left Eli momentarily speechless. The machine that had fed his family, the mechanical beast he had spent thousands of hours riding, steering, and repairing, was being dismissed for the price of a decent steak dinner. "50?" Eli choked out, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "50," Samuel confirmed, already writing the figure down on the official asset transfer form. "And frankly, you should take it. Otherwise, the bank will charge the estate the removal fee, which will just add to your outstanding deficit." The scene settled into a tense, heavy tableau. Samuel stood near the massive, cracked front tire of the combine, his head down, focused entirely on the paperwork on his clipboard. He was in his element, detached, calculating, completely oblivious to the emotional devastation he was finalizing. He wore his crisp blue shirt, dark slacks, and brown leather loafers, a picture of modern corporate efficiency contrasting jarringly with the rusted, hulking machinery behind him. Eli stood a few feet away, near the steel ladder that led up to the operator's cab and the grain tank. He was dressed in his faded, oil-stained overalls over a plaid shirt, a green John Deere cap pulled low over his eyes. His mouth was set in a hard, grim line. He looked at Samuel, then up at the towering red side of the combine. An overwhelming sense of finality washed over Eli. In a few minutes he would sign that paper, and the machine would belong to the bank, destined to be torn apart by blowtorches. A sudden, irrational urge gripped him. He needed to touch it one last time. He needed to say goodbye to the old girl, to check her over just once more before she was sent to the slaughterhouse. "Just a moment," Eli said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Let me check something." Samuel didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Make it quick, Mr. Vance." "I need to get moving." Eli grasped the metal rungs of the ladder. The steel was hot to the touch, baking in the sun. He hauled himself up, his old joints protesting with every step. He climbed past the dusty glass of the operator's cab, reaching the platform that ran alongside the massive, open-topped grain tank. He leaned heavily against the railing, catching his breath. He looked down into the massive steel bin. It was meant to hold over 100 bushels of golden corn or wheat, a sea of prosperity. Now it was a cavernous, empty shell. The angled sides of the tank were coated in a thick, undisturbed layer of gray dust and ancient chaff. Eli didn't know what he was looking for. He just wanted a moment away from Samuel's dismissive gaze. He reached down to open a small, square inspection hatch on the side of the tank housing, a panel used to clear blockages in the auger system. He gripped the rusty latch and pulled. It resisted for a moment, then gave way with a loud, shrieking creak of protesting metal that echoed across the quiet farmyard. Down below, Samuel flinched slightly at the noise but kept his eyes glued to his paperwork, clearly annoyed by the delay. Eli peered into the dark recess behind the hatch. It was pitch black, filled with decades of accumulated grime. He reached his hand inside, expecting to feel nothing but the cold steel of the auger flighting and perhaps the crumbling remains of an old mouse nest. He swept his calloused fingers through the thick dust. His hand brushed against something soft. Eli paused, his brow furrowing. He felt around further. It wasn't chaff, and it wasn't the hard edge of machinery. It felt like heavy fabric, cotton. He grabbed a fistful of it and pulled. A cloud of choking, ancient dust plumed out of the hatch as he dragged the bundle toward the light. It was a heavy, oil-soaked canvas rag, tightly wrapped around something solid and surprisingly heavy. It had been wedged deep behind the auger housing, intentionally hidden in a place no one would ever think to look unless they were tearing the machine completely apart. Eli's heart began to thump a heavy, irregular rhythm against his ribs. He carefully pulled back the stiff, greasy folds of the canvas. Beneath the rag was a metal box. It was about the size of a large shoebox, but heavy, made of thick, gauge steel. It was coated in the same dust as the rest of the tank, but underneath the grime, the metal was unnervingly pristine, untouched by the rust that plagued the rest of the combine. Eli ran his thumb across the lid, wiping away a streak of dirt to reveal dark, painted metal. At the front of the box was a heavy brass padlock, securely fastened through a thick steel hasp. Eli stared at the box, his mind racing. He knew every inch of this machine. He had replaced belts, greased bearings, and crawled inside every access panel over the years. This box did not belong here. It was not a factory part. Someone had deliberately hidden it. He looked down at the brass padlock. It was old, heavy, and formidable. He gave it a sharp tug. It held fast. "Everything all right up there, Eli?" Samuel's voice drifted up from the ground, tinged with a heavy sigh of impatience. Eli snapped his head down. Samuel was looking up at him now, shielding his eyes from the sun with one hand, holding the clipboard with the other. Instinct took over. With a speed that belied his age, Eli shoved the heavy metal box back into the dark recess of the inspection hatch. He hurriedly kicked the oily canvas rag over it, burying it back in the dust and shadows. He slammed the rusty metal hatch shut with a loud clatter. He gripped the railing, forcing his breathing to slow, arranging his features into a mask of stoic indifference. "Yeah," Eli called back down, his voice remarkably steady. "Just fine. Just clearing a mouse nest. Didn't want the scrappers getting a surprise." Samuel rolled his eyes, clearly unamused by the thought of farm vermin. "Fascinating. Can we finalize this now? I really am running behind schedule." "I'm coming down," Eli said. He descended the ladder much faster than he had climbed it. His mind was a whirlwind. What was in the box? Why was it hidden there? How long had it been there? He thought back over the history of the machine. His father had bought it. Had his father hidden it? Why? He reached the ground, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. Samuel was already holding out the clipboard, a cheap plastic pen pinched between his fingers. "Sign on the highlighted line at the bottom, Mr. Vance. This confirms your acceptance of the $50 valuation and transfers ownership of the asset to the holding company for liquidation and removal." Eli looked at the clipboard. The stark black ink on the white paper felt like an execution order. He looked at the line that said, 50 Zeros. 10 minutes ago, that number had filled him with a crushing despair. Now, looking at it, he felt a strange, electric thrill coursing through his veins. He took the pen from Samuel. His hand was trembling slightly, but not from age or sadness. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name, the jagged scrawl securing the transaction. "Excellent," Samuel said briskly, snatching the clipboard back the moment the ink left the pen. He tore off a thin yellow carbon copy and thrust it at Eli. "Here is your receipt for the asset transfer. The holding company will contact you within 30 days to arrange the removal of the scrap." Samuel turned on his heel, clearly eager to escape the heat, the dust, and the depressing reality of the failing farm. He marched back to his silver sedan, his pristine shoes kicking up small clouds of dirt. He opened the door, a blast of air-conditioned air briefly escaping into the sweltering afternoon, and slid into the leather driver's seat. He started the engine, threw the car in reverse, and whipped it around, accelerating too fast down the driveway, leaving a thick, billowing trail of Nebraska dust in his wake. Eli stood perfectly still, clutching the flimsy yellow receipt in his scarred hand. He watched the silver car until it disappeared over the horizon, the dust slowly settling back onto the parched earth. The farm was silent once again, just the sound of the wind rattling the dry cornstalks in the distance. He was alone. Eli crumpled the yellow receipt and shoved it deep into the pocket of his overalls. He turned his back on the driveway and faced the hulking red mass of the IH-1460. It wasn't just a piece of scrap metal anymore. It was a vault. He didn't hesitate. He turned and strode purposefully toward the open doors of the main tool shed. He bypassed the larger wrenches and hammers, his eyes scanning the chaotic workbench until he found what he needed: a heavy-duty, flathead screwdriver with a chipped handle and a solid steel framing hammer. Tools in hand, he walked back to the combine. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the rusted metal. He climbed the ladder again, his movements sharper now, fueled by a potent mix of adrenaline and desperate curiosity. He reached the platform, ignoring the ache in his knees. He grabbed the latch of the inspection hatch and wrenched it open. He reached into the darkness, pushed aside the oily canvas, and gripped the heavy metal box with both hands, hauling it out into the daylight. He set it down on the grated metal platform of the combine. Up close, the box looked even more out of place. It was undeniably old, but built with a precision that farm equipment rarely possessed. Eli knelt beside it. He wedged the thick, flat head of the screwdriver into the small gap between the brass padlock and the steel hasp. He gripped the handle of the screwdriver tightly with his left hand, angling it upward. He raised the heavy steel hammer in his right hand. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He brought the hammer down with a vicious, resounding clang. The noise was deafening against the metal platform. The padlock shifted, but held. Eli gritted his teeth. He wedged the screwdriver deeper, finding a better angle of leverage against the ancient brass mechanism. He raised the hammer higher this time, putting the weight of his shoulders into the swing. Clang! Crack! The shackle of the padlock snapped with the sharp sound of a fired rifle. The heavy brass lock fell away, clattering onto the metal grating and rolling toward the edge of the platform. Eli tossed the hammer and screwdriver aside. They clanked against the metal railing, forgotten. He stared at the box. The hasp was free. There was nothing holding it shut anymore. His calloused fingers reached out, trembling violently now. He grabbed the edge of the heavy steel lid. He paused for a fraction of a second, a sudden, terrifying thought flashing through his mind. What if it was nothing? What if it was just old tools or a forgotten cache of rusted bolts? What if the $50 really was all he had left in the world? He pushed the thought away and lifted the lid. The hinges, unlike the rusty ones on the combine, were well-oiled and silent. The lid fell back, exposing the contents to the Nebraska sun for the first time in decades. Eli stopped breathing. It wasn't tools. It wasn't bolts. Sitting in the center of the box, nestled securely in a bed of yellowed, brittle paper, was an object that defied his understanding. It was a complex, beautifully machined assembly of highly polished brass and gleaming surgical steel. It looked like a component from an engine, perhaps a fuel injector or a pump, but the design was radically different from anything he had ever seen in 50 years of working on diesel mechanics. It possessed an intricate geometry, a perfection of form that caught the fading sunlight and threw brilliant, golden reflections across Eli's weathered face. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the polished metal. But before he touched the strange device, his eyes fell upon the papers it rested on. They were blueprints. Old, hand-drawn schematics on heavy drafting paper, the edges curled and browned with age, and resting on top of the blueprints, sitting right next to the gleaming brass mechanism, was a small velvet-lined box, its lid open to reveal a tarnished silver medal hanging from a faded ribbon. Eli slowly picked up the topmost piece of paper. The ink was faded, but the blocky, precise architectural lettering was unmistakable. It was his father's handwriting. He read the title block in the corner of the schematic, the words blurring slightly as moisture suddenly pricked his eyes. Project Vanguard, high-pressure rotary injection prototype. D. Vance, lead engineer, International Harvester Advanced R&D. Below the date, October 1978, was a single, hastily scribbled note in his father's hand, written in red ink across the bottom of the page. They are trying to bury it. I won't let them. Hide it where they won't look. Eli stared at the note, then down at the gleaming, impossibly perfect piece of machinery resting inside the box. The sound of Samuel's silver car was long gone, but the echo of his words, $50 for scrap, rang in Eli's ears. He looked out over the dying farm, the sinking sun casting a fiery glow over the rusted outbuildings. The old combine groaned slightly as the metal cooled in the evening air. It wasn't a tomb, it was a safe, and Samuel Harrison had just valued a piece of hidden history, a stolen legacy, at the price of a tank of gas. The fading amber light of the Nebraska evening barely penetrated the dusty windows of Eli's farmhouse kitchen. He sat at the scarred oak table, the contents of the heavy steel box spread out before him like sacred relics. The brass and surgical steel mechanism sat in the center, catching the meager light from the single overhead bulb. It was heavy, complex, and beautiful, a stark contrast to the rusted behemoth that had guarded it for over 4 decades. Beside it lay the velvet box holding his grandfather's silver star, a silent testament to the Vance family's grit. But it was the other items that held Eli's immediate attention. The stack of brittle, hand-drawn blueprints, and a standard plastic audio cassette tape, its label bearing only the date November 1981 in his father's cramped handwriting. Eli had to rummage through the attic for nearly an hour before he found an old, battery-operated boombox that still functioned. He brought it down, blew the dust from the tape deck, and carefully inserted the cassette. He pressed play. There was a long hiss of static, followed by the heavy sound of someone clearing their throat. Then, a voice filled the quiet kitchen. "If you're listening to this, Eli, then either I'm gone or the bastards finally stopped looking." Eli closed his eyes. It was his father, David Vance. The voice was younger than Eli remembered it at the end, strong and vibrating with a suppressed, anxious energy. "They call it the Vanguard system," the recorded voice continued, accompanied by the faint sound of papers shuffling. "High-pressure rotary injection. It increases fuel efficiency by 30% and torque by 20%. I designed it. I built the prototype in the R&D lab in Chicago. But the company, they were bleeding money, Eli. The executives didn't want a revolution. They wanted a quick sale. They were negotiating a buyout, and a revolutionary engine design would have complicated the merger. They ordered the project scrapped, ordered the blueprints burned, and the prototype melted down." A bitter laugh crackled through the speaker. "They wanted to bury my life's work to make a ledger look pretty. I couldn't let them. I took the primary assembly. I took the master schematics. I drove through the night back to the farm and I hid it in the belly of the beast. The 1460 was brand new then, an experimental pre-production model they let me field test. They came looking, of course, corporate security, lawyers. They tore my office apart, but they never thought to look in a grain tank in the middle of nowhere." The voice softened, taking on a heavy, apologetic tone. "I'm sorry I never told you, son. It was too dangerous. They could have taken the farm, ruined you. I kept waiting for the dust to settle, for the right time to patent it under a dummy corporation, but my heart gave out before I could finish the fight. The Vanguard is yours now, Eli. Do what you will with it, but don't let them have it for nothing." The tape clicked to a stop, leaving the kitchen drowning in silence. Eli stared at the brass mechanism. It wasn't just a part. It was his father's vindication. It was a stolen piece of agricultural history. Eli knew engines, but he didn't know the modern world of patents, historical archives, or corporate litigation. He needed help. The next morning, before the sun had fully crested the horizon, Eli was knocking on the door of the neighboring property. The Miller farm had been bought out by a young couple from Lincoln who ran a small, organic operation. Their teenage son, a bright kid named Leo who lived half his life on the internet, answered the door, rubbing his eyes. "Mr. Vance, everything okay?" "Leo, I need to use your computer," Eli said, his voice carrying an urgency that woke the boy up immediately. "And I need you to help me find some people who care about old International Harvester history, the real deep-in-the-weeds folks." For the next 4 hours, the two of them sat huddled in front of a glowing monitor. Leo navigated forums, digital archives, and specialized collector groups that Eli never knew existed. They searched for Project Vanguard, David Vance, and the specific serial numbers Eli had copied from the combine's chassis plate. When Leo finally hit the right database, a private registry maintained by a coalition of agricultural historians and high-end antique machinery collectors, the screen flooded with red-flagged notifications. "Mr. Vance," Leo breathed, pointing at the screen. "According to this, the serial number on your combine, it shouldn't exist. It's listed as a ghost machine, a pre-production chassis that was supposedly destroyed by the manufacturer in 1981. Eli leaned back, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. The combine wasn't just a rusted hulk, it was a unicorn, and the prize inside it was the holy grail of lost engine technology. 200 miles away in a sleek, glass-walled office in Omaha, Samuel Harrison was having a very different kind of morning. He was sipping a lukewarm macchiato, casually entering the previous day's acquisitions into the Asset Liquidation Solutions database. He typed in the details of the Vance farm, the John Deere tractor, the scrap metal, and finally the IH-1460 combine. He entered the serial number and hit submit, ready to flag it for the Lincoln salvage yard. The system froze. A loud, obnoxious chime echoed from his speakers. A bright yellow warning banner flashed across the screen. Restricted asset. Manual override required. Contact acquisitions. Director immediately. Samuel frowned, annoyed by the glitch. He clicked the notification, digging into the metadata of the flag. What he read made the blood drain entirely from his face. The flag hadn't been generated by their internal scrap valuation algorithm. It had been triggered by an automated web crawler linked to an external database, a database monitored by the Smithsonian's Agricultural Annex and a consortium of billionaire private collectors. Asset match, experimental chassis, 1460X, believed destroyed 1981, associated with missing R&D Project Vanguard. Samuel's hands began to shake. He frantically opened a new tab, running a quick search on the terms. The results were scarce, mostly rumors on obscure message boards, but they all pointed to the same thing: a lost prototype, a missing engineer, and a piece of machinery that collectors would pay a fortune to possess. He looked at the digital copy of the receipt he had forced Eli to sign. Value, $50,000. If his boss saw this, if the company liquidated a historically priceless artifact for the price of scrap iron, Samuel wouldn't just be fired. His career in asset management would be over. The liability alone would be catastrophic. He had a narrow window to fix this before the paperwork was fully processed and the salvage yard dispatched a truck. He didn't bother telling his secretary where he was going. He grabbed his keys, sprinted to the elevator, and practically flew out of the parking garage. The silver sedan broke several speed limits as Samuel tore down the interstate, his mind racing with panicked calculations. He needed to get the combine. He needed to buy it back from Vance or tear up the contract, whatever it took. He would offer $10,000, $20,000. Hell, he had authorization up to $50,000 for unexpected high-value discoveries without needing board approval. By the time Samuel's car violently bounced down the dirt road leading to the Vance farm, the sun was high and blistering again. He slammed on the brakes, throwing the car into park before it had even fully stopped. He jogged toward the farmhouse, his crisp blue shirt already sticking to his back with sweat. "Eli, Mr. Vance." There was no answer from the porch. Samuel hurried toward the large barn. As he rounded the corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. The scene was entirely different from the day before. The rusted behemoth of the IH-1460 was no longer a discarded piece of junk. It had been carefully swept clean of the loose dust and cobwebs. A heavy, waterproof tarp was neatly folded on the roof of the cab, ready to be deployed. A sturdy chain barricade had been erected around the perimeter of the machine, supported by heavy steel fence posts. Sitting in a lawn chair in the shade of the combine's massive front tire was Eli. He was drinking iced tea from a mason jar, looking entirely relaxed. "You're back early," Eli said, his gravelly voice calm and measured. "The scrap truck isn't scheduled for another 30 days, Mr. Harrison." Samuel forced a laugh, wiping his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. "Right, well, about that. Eli, listen, I was doing some secondary evaluations, looking over the paperwork, and, well, my conscience got the better of me." Eli took a slow sip of his tea. "Your conscience?" "Yes," Samuel lied smoothly, stepping closer to the barricade. "I realized I was entirely too harsh yesterday. This machine, it has sentimental value to you. And honestly, the scrap market fluctuated slightly overnight. I'd like to tear up that $50 contract. I can offer you a much fairer price. Say $5,000? Cash, today. We leave the farm free and clear." Eli didn't move. He just looked at Samuel with a gaze that felt like sandpaper. $5,000. That's a mighty big fluctuation for rusty iron. Samuel swallowed hard. The old man was playing dumb, but Samuel couldn't risk it. "Okay, let's cut to the chase. $10,000. $10,000, Eli. That will pay off a significant chunk of your arrears." "The contract is signed, Samuel," Eli said softly. "You own it for $50. You told me so yourself. Contracts can be voided." Samuel's voice cracked slightly, his polished corporate veneer cracking under the Nebraska sun. "Look, 25,000. That's my final offer. You're robbing me blind, but I want to do the right thing." Eli slowly stood up from the lawn chair. He walked to the chain barricade, resting his calloused hands on the cold steel. He looked at the young, panicked appraiser, seeing right through the expensive suit and the desperate lies. "You ran the serial number," Eli stated. It wasn't a question. Samuel froze. I don't know what you mean." "You ran the plate, your computer pinged, and you realized you just bought a ghost for $50, Eli continued, his voice devoid of anger, replaced by a cold, hard authority. "You realized my father's machine isn't scrap. You realized what it was hiding." Samuel's shoulders slumped. The game was up. "How much do you want, Vance? Name your price. 50 grand. I can write the check right now. Do you know how much trouble I'm in if I don't secure this asset properly?" "You don't own it, Samuel," Eli said. "I have your signature," Samuel yelled, pointing toward his car. Eli reached into the pocket of his overalls and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't the yellow carbon copy. It was a printout from Leo's computer. "My father," Eli said, unfolding the paper, "was a brilliant man, but he was also paranoid. When he hid the Vanguard prototype in the grain tank, he didn't just walk away. He formally reported the 1460 chassis stolen to the county sheriff in 1981. Eli held up the printed police report. He hid it in plain sight on his own property, but legally this machine has been classified as stolen property for 45 years. "You cannot legally purchase, transfer, or liquidate stolen goods, Mr. Harrison. Your $50 contract is null and void. As the sole heir to David Vance, I am simply reclaiming recovered stolen property." Samuel stared at the paper, the color draining from his face once more. The legal loophole was airtight. His company's legal department would never touch a disputed, 40-year-old stolen property claim, especially one involving a high-profile corporate prototype. He had lost. "What are you going to do with it?" Samuel asked, his voice barely a whisper, defeated. "I've already made some calls," Eli said, turning his back on Samuel and looking up at the rusted giant. By noon the following day, the dirt road to the Vance farm saw more traffic than it had in a decade. First came a heavy-duty flatbed transport truck, escorted by a private security vehicle. Then came a black SUV bearing the discreet logo of the National Agricultural Historical Archive. Dr. Siki. Eris Thorne, a leading historian and curator for the archive, stepped out of the SUV. He was an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and an aura of intense, reverent excitement. He didn't wear a suit. He wore practical khakis and work boots. Eli met him by the combine. He had brought the heavy steel box down from the house and placed it on a sturdy workbench he'd dragged out into the yard. Dr. Thorne didn't even look at the combine first. He walked straight to the workbench. He donned a pair of white cotton gloves and, with trembling hands, lifted the polished brass and steel mechanism from the box. He spent 20 minutes examining it in silence, using a jeweler's loupe to inspect the micromachining and the stamped serial numbers. He compared the physical object to the brittle blueprints, tracing the lines of his father's designs. Finally, Dr. Thorne set the device down and looked at Eli. There were tears in the historian's eyes. "The Vanguard," Dr. Thorne whispered. "It wasn't a myth. International harvester historians have argued for decades about whether David Vance actually built a working model before the purge. This changes the entire timeline of agricultural engineering in the late 20th century." He turned his gaze to the rusted 1460 combine. "And this is the host chassis?" "She's the one," Eli said proudly. "Kept it safe all these years." Dr. Thorne took a deep breath. "Mr. Vance, the archive, backed by our coalition of private benefactors, has authorized me to make an immediate, non-negotiable offer for the Vanguard prototype, the original blueprints, and the host chassis. We want to preserve it exactly as it is, as a complete historical exhibit. The story of the hidden invention is as important as the invention itself." Dr. Thorne pulled a sealed envelope from his jacket and handed it to Eli. "We believe this properly reflects the historical and technological significance of your father's work." Eli opened the envelope. He pulled out a cashier's check. He stared at the number printed on the heavy, watermarked paper. It took a moment for his brain to process the zeros. $750,000. It was enough to pay off the bank twice over. It was enough to fix the roof, buy new equipment, and set up a trust fund that would keep the Vance farm in the family for another 100 years. "Is this agreeable, Mr. Vance?" Dr. Thorne asked gently. Eli looked from the check to the brass prototype, then up to the fading red paint of the combine. He thought of his father, working late into the night, fighting a losing battle against corporate greed, and finally choosing to bury his legacy rather than see it destroyed. "My father would have liked that," Eli said, his voice thick with emotion. "He wanted it to mean something. He didn't want it to just disappear." "It won't disappear, Eli," Dr. Thorne assured him. "It will be the centerpiece of our new wing, the David Vance exhibit of agricultural innovation." The loading process took hours. A specialized crane carefully lifted the rusted combine onto the flatbed trailer, securing it with heavy chains. It looked strangely majestic up there, a wounded veteran being carried off the battlefield with honors. The steel box containing the prototype and the blueprints was secured in a biometric safe inside the security vehicle. Eli stood on his porch and watched the convoy kick up dust as it slowly rolled down the driveway. In Omaha, Samuel Harrison was packing his desk into a cardboard box. The report had been filed. The error was too colossal to ignore. He hadn't just misvalued an asset, he had missed a historic artifact, lost a massive commission for the firm, and exposed them to potential legal embarrassment. He had learned a brutal lesson about the difference between looking and actually seeing. Back on the farm, the evening sun cast a warm, golden glow over the land. The heavy silence had returned, but it no longer felt oppressive. It felt peaceful. The bank's foreclosure notices were already in the trash burn barrel. Eli walked out to the spot where the combine had sat for so many years. The ground was stained with old oil and marked by the deep impressions of the massive tires. He knelt down, picked up a handful of the dry Nebraska dirt, and let it sift slowly through his calloused fingers. The farm was safe. The debt was gone. But more importantly, the heavy burden of failure that had rested on his shoulders for years had been lifted. The world had looked at his life, at his machinery, and told him it was worthless. They had offered him $50 for his history, but his father had known better. Eli smiled, standing up and dusting off his hands. He turned and walked back toward the farmhouse, the sound of his boots steady and strong on the ground. He had a lot of work to do tomorrow. The tractor needed a new gasket, and for the first time in a very long time he could afford to buy it.